This is the argument that Thomas Aquinas presents as the first way of proving the existence of God in the Summa Theologia. First part, question 2, article 3. I won't read it for obvious reasons, but you can pause the video if you want to examine it in full. Let us try to flesh out the principles that underpin Thomas's understanding of this argument. The first thing we must do is clarify the meaning of the term that is usually translated as motion, for he does not intend to simply mean movement from one location to another, but also change over time. Thomas is referring here to a concept grounded in Aristotle's hylomorphism. Hylomorphism is the idea that all physical things in the universe are a composite of matter and form. At its simplest, matter is the stuff that a substance is made from, and form is the shape that it takes, although we will want to build on this definition later. This becomes more interesting when we learn that matter exists as potentiality. This means that it can take on various forms, and that it always retains the power to be potentially something that it is not. For example, the acorn is potentially an oak tree. What makes the acorn actually an acorn is its form, and if it becomes an oak tree, it will have the form of an oak tree. So while matter is potentiality, form is actuality. What is more, the transformation of acorn to oak tree is part of what Thomas classifies as motion. We simply cannot understand this argument without understanding hylomorphism. To the argument, Thomas begins by saying,
The first and more manifest way is the argument from motion.
Although all he is doing is introducing the argument here, it is interesting that Thomas has graded this argument from motion as the most manifest of the five for the existence of God. He follows it up by insisting that
it is certain and evident to our senses that in the world some things are in motion.
This actually hasn't always been certain to everyone. Ancient Greek philosopher Parmenides took up the task of arguing that motion was illusory. His student Zeno followed this up with a set of paradoxes that were designed to show that the notion of change was logically contradictory. Thomas does not seem to think that these are worthy of consideration, and we have to assume that is because he is already committed to the concept of hylomorphism, which was specifically designed to counter these arguments. And he says that just 2 lines into the first way when he writes,
For motion is nothing else than the reduction of something from potentiality to actuality.
So we can rephrase slightly to say, it is certain and evident to our senses that in the world some things go from potentiality to actuality. Yet it is important to highlight these concerns, even though Thomas seems to dismiss them. Philosophers have had a problem with the concept of motion, what it is, how we account for it, and if someone were to come across Thomas's argument without understanding hylomorphism, these hang-ups will be injected into his argument. That is why we should prefer to identify that things go from potentiality to actuality, above saying that some things are in motion. Surrounding this, we can examine a more controversial claim. Thomas says,
Now whatever is in motion is put in motion by another. For nothing can be in motion except it is in potentiality to that towards which it is in motion, whereas a thing moves inasmuch as it is in act. But nothing can be reduced from potentiality to actuality, except by something in a state of actuality.
At this point, those who misinterpret the term motion are inclined to object to this claim on the grounds of Newton's first law, the law of inertia.
An object will remain at rest or continue moving at a constant velocity in a straight line, unless acted upon by an unbalanced force.
The objection runs that motion is as natural a state as being at rest. Aquinas then has no reason to favour being in one state over the other as the primary natural state. I think there is a fairly simple response to this objection using the framework that we have already identified. If we think of the law of inertia in Aristotelian terms, what this is saying is that an object in potentiality cannot be put into actuality without its natural path being disrupted. Whether the object is physically moving through space or not is not relevant. An object at rest is in potentiality. If it is then moved by another, it is placed in actuality. But this is also true for the object in physical motion now. It is potentially at rest. It requires a change to its actuality to bring that about. So it is not that Thomas favours one or the other state. It is that he is not talking about motion in the Newtonian sense of physical movement. And lo and behold, he goes on to make that very point.
Now it is not possible that the same thing should be at once in actuality and potentiality in the same respect, but only in different respects. For what is actually hot cannot simultaneously be potentially hot, but it is simultaneously potentially cold. It is therefore impossible that in the same respect and in the same way a thing should be both mover and moved, i.e. that it should move itself.
Here he is using the example of wood being heated by fire. If the wood is actually cold, it is potentially hot. It cannot heat itself. It requires the fire that is actually hot to change the wood from being potentially hot to actually hot. When that happens, the wood is now potentially cold. So it can be potentially hot and potentially cold, or actually hot and actually cold, but it cannot be either of these things at the same time. In other words, cannot be both actually hot and potentially hot concurrently. Thomas' conclusion, therefore, is that it is impossible that in the same respect and in the same way a thing should be both mover and moved, i.e. that it should move itself. If the wood is hot, it is potentially cold, but it cannot move itself to be actually cold. It will continue to be hot until a force acts to bring about its being cold. At this point, it is common for an objection to be raised with reference to quantum mechanics. It relies upon the concept of quantum superposition. That is the point at which a system is able to exist in multiple states simultaneously, until it is observed or measured. The classic example is Schrödinger's cat, that is both alive and dead inside the box until the box is opened. Does this not allow for the circumstance where the wood may be both hot and cold? In contrast to this being a fatal problem, it may be that Aristotelian hylomorphism gives us the tools to allow us to describe what is going on with quantum change. This is why, at the point of probabilistic calculation, we may have multiple simultaneous states. All of these are what Thomas would call potentialities, and none of them are actualities. The problem we have is in being able to predict which one of the potentialities does come to be actualized. Not that more than one can be actualized at the same time. While in the box, Schrödinger's cat is potentially alive or potentially dead. In fact, it is actually one of these things and potentially the other. The fact that the calculation is probabilistic does not negate the fact that both cannot be actualized at the same time. So far we have made sense of the first way like this. It is certain and evident to our senses that in the world some things go from potentiality to actuality. Nothing can be reduced from potentiality to actuality except by something in a state of actuality. It is impossible that a thing should be in potentiality and actuality in the same respect and in the same way. Therefore, nothing can move itself from potentiality to actuality. If you have made it this far into the argument, congratulations! It might be a good time to take a breather. While you do, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. And don't forget to ring the bell to be notified of when the next video in the series is released. It is at this point in the argument that Thomas tends to receive the most resistance. So let's see if we can address the concerns. He says,
If that by which it is put in motion be itself put in motion, then this also must needs be put in motion by another, and that by another again. But this cannot go on into infinity, because then there would be no first mover, and consequently no other mover, seeing that subsequent movers move only inasmuch as they are put in motion by the first mover, as the staff moves only because it is put in motion by the hand.
this elliptical passage is commonly simplified to, there can be no infinite regress of movers. This is not helpful. results in a range of objections that attempt to establish that infinite regresses are possible. We obviously have it with numbers, for example, but a good example in this case is the claim that the universe itself may be infinite. The idea of an infinite universe was not unknown to Thomas. Aristotle believed that the universe was infinite in time, and Thomas did not rule the possibility out. So why does he rule in the possibility of an infinite universe and rule out the possibility of an infinite regress of movers? He tells us when he says there would be no first mover and consequently no other mover. Just as with all the other objections, we can turn this one on its head, because Thomas is not proposing that we empirically follow a causal chain back until we find the first mover. If we do that, we will not find one. All we could expect to find is an infinite regress, and paradoxically, no motion at all. Why is that? Because there can be no potentiality without actuality. Take the acorn. It is potentially an oak tree, but it cannot potentially be anything without actually being an acorn. If we refer back then to the most basic principles of Aristotle's hylomorphism, matter is potentiality, but it cannot be anything without form. Thomas concludes then that,
therefore it is necessary to arrive at a first mover put in motion by no other, and this everyone understands to be God.
put in motion by no other because it is pure act, pure form, not comprised of any potentiality whatsoever, and this everyone understands to be God. One of the key points here is to recognise that with a first mover, an infinite regress does make sense. We can have a chain of events stretching back to infinity of potentiality becoming actuality, as long as it is grounded in pure act, not as a first link in the causal chain, but as the cause of the chain itself. But we will see this more clearly as we examine the next way, the argument from causation. So here is our final formulation of the argument. It is certain and evident to our senses that in the world some things go from potentiality to actuality. Nothing can be reduced from potentiality to actuality except by something in a state of actuality. It is impossible that a thing should be in potentiality and actuality in the same respect and in the same way. Therefore, nothing can move itself from potentiality to actuality. There cannot be an infinite regress from actuality to potentiality. Therefore, there must be something that is pure act, and that we call God. Well, we have run over time on this one, but thanks for seeing it through to the end. Don't forget to like, subscribe and ring the bell to be kept up to date when the next video drops.